have been plenty of characters which were doom posted to celestial heights in the past, or had kits that didn't seem all that promising, yet ended up being very powerful against all odds. So today, I thought it'd be fun to discuss all the Genshin characters who exceeded expectations in recent history. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. I'm going to be covering characters starting from 4.0 and ending at 5.1, which is where we're currently at now, since I'd like to focus on units who experienced this in recent history. With that out of the way, let's go. I think a character that was absolutely heavily underestimated before she came out will be Navia. There was one very simple reason for this. She is Geo. It's always had a pretty poor reputation in this game, so naturally, folks had little faith in a Geo main DPS when the element felt like it was totally down in the dumps. It's not like there weren't any good Geos, of course. After all, Zhongli is a thing. Yet, even so, it remained as the element with the complete worst track record out of all of them. So expectations when it came to Navia were pretty low. I personally always had faith in her. The showcased kit looked unique, and she seemed to bend the pre-established rules that most Geo characters have been following up until that point. Wanting to play with at least 2 non-Geo units was already a refreshing change of pace for Mono Geo, and she actually uses Crystallize. When Navia actually released, what do you know? She ended up being an absolute nuking queen. Unsurprisingly, her damage numbers were incredibly good, and considering how quickly she casts her nukes, she ended up having a really solid amount of team versatility. To this day, Navia continues to be an incredibly powerful Geo DPS that literally anybody can get great use out of. Cinder City Kachina and Xianyun only helped her case even further, pushing her from being a great DPS into an S-tier one. I don't blame anybody for having underestimated her. Geo units tended to be pretty disappointing, but in my opinion, perhaps this is copium, but I do think the element has gotten a lot better recently. Well, not so much the element itself, but the character kits that are coming out of it. Even old Mono Geo teams got a big leg up when Shiori came out. However, it seems like most people realize the Spina leader's wild strength nowadays. So all's well that ends well. Next up, I want to talk about Xianyun. I feel like in her case, it was more of a fear of the unknown. What she offers is incredibly unique in comparison to other Animo supports, and there's not only that, she also lacks a core integral part of every Animo character's identity. Xianyun doesn't deal in grouping. This was a cause for concern for many people. How could an Animo that doesn't group be any good? Skepticism was ripe when it came to her plunge-based mechanics too. Aside from Xiao and Gaming, literally who would care for such things? On the whole, there was plenty of folks who completely lacked faith in Xianyun's success as a character. She was such a radical departure from any Animo unit that we had previously gotten, and without grouping, what was her purpose even going to be? Well, she came out, and not only did she save Diluc and turn him into an A-tier DPS, but she also unlocked plunge-based combos for so many teams. With her, you can weave plunge-based combos into the rotations of many units, which ended up being especially beneficial for some. For example, before Xianyun came out, Navia Plunge was the best way to play her for a very long time. Or how she saved C0 Hu Tao players, because she offers them a playstyle that doesn't feel completely horrendous to play. Sure, she didn't group, but it's not like she had to anyway. There'd always be some other character in her team who'd be able to take care of AoE if it was really necessary. Think about it. Xiao's whole gimmick is that his plunges have a massive AoE, and if not, the Abyss is incredibly boss or 2-target centric nowadays. It's not like there's much mobbing content in Floor 12 to worry about in the first place. Plus, Xianyun's plunging buff only applies to one enemy at a time, so the chances are you'll be playing her more in single target-centric scenarios in the first place. She certainly exceeded expectations and ended up becoming one of this game's top-tier units. Once again, I felt like she was going to be great from the very beginning, and it excites me to see that in hindsight, I was right. But the next character I'm going to talk about, I couldn't have been more wrong. I will be completely 100% with you. I did not have any faith in Chevreuse when she was releasing. An overload unit. Overload! You mean that one crappy reaction that is oftentimes more of a hindrance to teams more than anything else? How could they possibly make a 4-star revolve around such a reaction and have them not suck? I thought this was going to be Hoyo going back to making completely garbage 4-star units. I was absolutely not prepared for her to be as good as she was. I wasn't completely alone in my thinking. While I personally saw less doom and gloom surrounding Chevreuse compared to somebody like Xianyun, there were certainly fellow non-believers that felt like an overload character would end up being pointless no matter what. Much like the Geo case, could you blame us? Overload had done next to nothing in the game up until this point. Then she came out and ended up being absolutely fire. She revived the dead reaction, turning it into an option that was unironically worth considering. Plus, she was great right out of the box at C0, which for Genshin 4-star standards is very, very impressive. At first, it was Raiden, Shogun, and Sino who received some hearty buffs. The almighty Shogun got an upgrade over Kazuha in her hyper teams, and the Mahamatra finally got a team in which his multi-wave does not fall off of a cliff and take a nosedive into a pile of eyes of perceptions. Uemiya Overload finally became infinitely more viable than it was before, and every other Pyro plus Electro DPS was able to experience a brand new playstyle. While it wasn't best in slot for every single one of them, it still ended up being a viable option. Arlecchino also ended up utilizing the comp quite well when she came out. While vape teams are definitely better for her, this was a really solid, easy to play, consistent option for you to choose. Clorinde, who came right after Favre, is the true recipient of Chevreuse's buffs. Her overload teams are literally insane, and no other Electro DPS is able to compare to the wild numbers that this comp can deal in these comps. When she first came out, I'll admit, I underrated her overload teams quite a bit, but now that a lot of time has passed, I can safely say that Clorox's overload is not to be slept on. This is all not mentioning the comp's insane C6 that elevates her performance to a whole nother level. You know, I'm starting to see a bit of a trend here when it comes to units that were underestimated in the past. I'll touch on that soon. Funnily enough, next up is Clorinde. Many underestimated her due to her uptime not being that long. That'd mean one rotating bosses would be harder. Whatever will we do? However, the good news is that this literally did not matter at all, because her damage as an Electro DPS is so damn high that her short uptime doesn't really mean anything at this stage. Would it have been nice? Sure, but she still ended up being a wildly powerful Electro DPS. I think the issue with her is simply that she came out right after one of the absolute best characters in the game got released. Those are some massive heels to fill, literally, because Arlecchino was immediately declared as being one of the best shortly after her release. Clorinde is by no means bad, she basically just wasn't as impressive as the character that preceded her. I personally would have switched their release dates because then people would have had a much different reaction to her, I feel. After all, she ended up fixing all issues with Aggravate by adding self-sustain to the team and a very smooth, quick-fire rotation at the same time. Plus, her having a short uptime isn't all that bad. It means that she's able to utilize really short buffs super effectively, such as Kujo Sara C6. Very cool. I think most people have come around to the fact that she's a really good DPS. Obviously, she doesn't stand among the game's S tiers, but she's still definitely within the mid to high A range, at least in my opinion. She has some of the most effective flexibility there is, having 3 really good, solid teams. That's real versatility right there. The best Electro DPS that you can play right now for sure. I did underrate her a little before, but I'm happy to say that I truly acknowledge her strength now. Emilie is one of the more recent cases of this happening. 2 things affected her in this case. One, she had Chevreuse syndrome, where people didn't believe in burning whatsoever, so a sub-DPS made for it surely wouldn't be that good. Secondly, she came out right before Notlon, so people were holding onto their primos for the broken Notlon cast that was soon to come up. To put it simply, when she released, damage, and a lot of it. Even before Kenichi came out, you could slap her into teams of Arlecchino or Linny in place of Xiangling and completely fry the content ahead of you. However, then Notlon came out, and the incredibly predictable event of Emilie being a great unit for the new characters happened. While Mualani can indeed use Nahida for her EM buffing A1, have fun with multi-wave, because Emilie is 10 times more smooth to use with the Shark Surfer in such situations. Her perfume bottles can shoot Dendro onto foes from really far away, and she also packs quite a meaty punch in these teams. So even if Nahida is indeed a great unit here, I personally find Emilie to be way more comfortable to use. Her synergy with Kenichi was basically a given from moment number 1. Literally anybody could have seen this coming. No way, the burning sub-DPS works well with the burning and Burgeon main DPS. She's excellent at maintaining burning on the enemies while making it very easy for Kenichi to fire off 4 nukes during a skill up time. That's much harder to do without the Perfumer. I do think there were a fair portion of people that knew she would be good, but didn't want to pull before a new region was to be released. However, I saw plenty who were very concerned over the amount of use cases that she'd have, and to be honest, I myself thought that she'd only become really good when Kenichi came out. However, what do you know? It seemed like the current pyro DPSs that were already around when she came out could utilize her just fine. So while she does still have the flaw of wanting burning to make herself good, less so to make burning good, she helps form some of this game's few serious burning teams, reviving a dead reaction. Plus, she's a part of the best modern Burgeon team to date. So remember earlier when I said I realized a pretty common trend here? My theory is that the thread that seems to connect all of this Doom posting is both not being open to newer mechanics and failing to see how something that has historically been awful could suddenly become good. With the first one, I think the lesson that we can all learn from this is that if a character has a somewhat unconventional kit, that probably means they are an evolution of what that element or character archetype is, and will push new grounds. We should no longer look at odd kits with skepticism, but rather meet them with intrigue, because every character that has been like this in recent memory has ended up being mid-A tier at the very least. There will be exceptions to every rule, of course. We will naturally still get some bad, weird kits in the future. Where there is the desirable, there is also the undesirable to accompany. Just because Xianyun has a weird Bond of Life passive that makes no sense doesn't mean that she's suddenly A tier. There obviously still has to be some rhyme or reason to the kit mechanics. But with how good recent weird kits have been, I honestly look forward to characters now when I see that their mechanics are weird or unconventional in the special programs. For me, the big mindset shift happened post-Chevreuse. She was a character that had literally no reason to be good at all based on past history, but ended up being really, really solid. Then for the second reason, being that the past would imply that such a kit would not succeed in the current day. I can't fault this way of thinking because it's logically sound. It makes sense that somebody would come to conclusions on a character based on negative experiences in the past. Like with Navia, come on. Geo had been bad for 3 years. It's not like people's skepticism was pulled out of thin air. I think that, out of this video at least, Clorinde was the one exception to this rule. Her kit is fairly standard, and we've had successful Electro DPSs far before her. She was more a case of coming out after one of the strongest DPS characters in the entire game. Naturally, it was going to take a little bit of time for people to properly test her out and appreciate her strength. So how should we look at future releases? I think that we should let go of any preconceived biases towards how weird a kit may be, but continue to use logic in assessing the future potential of a character. Naturally, we'll all find out eventually how good they are over time, but hey, power scaling is a lot of fun. We PvP over it for a reason after all. It's because we can discover so many things about a character even just days after their release that I like to make a post-release impressions video on new characters after they've come out. Even if I'm just reconfirming pros or cons that I analyzed before, it's important to understand how important the test of time is to a character's reputation. Ultimately, don't feel bad if your first impressions of a unit turn out to be wrong, because accurate power scaling is tricky business, and if you get things right, then pat yourself on the back. Good job. The important thing is knowing what to look for in a kit, and trying to set aside any previous negative experiences. You have to look at the unit themselves, separating them from whatever else came before, unless there's extremely close comparisons to be drawn, of course. Recent characters have shown that unique equals good, especially in Notlan, where uniqueness in the kits appears to be the main gimmick of most units. But what do you think about all of this? Were there any characters here that you may have underhyped before they came out? Or did you land the mark with all of these lads? Did you perhaps have another unit in mind that I forgot to mention? Let me know down below in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hopefully this video was able to tell you about the Genshin characters that completely exceeded everybody's expectations. This has been Juice, signing out, and Xianyun exceeded my expectations in terms of travel. Like, oh my goodness, she has been glued to my overworld team ever since I got her. Kinich 2, this grappling hook is easily the best Notlan travel ability outside of Notlan.